My name is Dr. Suad Ali. I am a professor of Arabic literature, Middle Eastern and Islamic studies in the School of International Letters and Cultures. I am also head of classics and Middle Eastern studies, and I'm the founding chair of the ASU Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies that is hosting this event. And by the way, this event is part of the Humanities Week that is run by the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Dean of Humanities, Professor David Cohen. And I will begin first by giving a short background about the Council of Arabic Islamic Studies, then introduce Professor Suad Joseph, then give her the floor to give her talk. Okay. The Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies was established at Arizona State University to acknowledge the significant contributions of Arabic studies and Islamic civilization and cultures to the world at large, both historically and in the modern age. The Council's research and teaching programs seek to promote multiculturalism, inclusive excellence, interfaith dialogue, cross-cultural understanding, and the expansion of human civilization and cultures through Arabic, as well as other Middle Eastern languages taught in the School of International Letters and Cultures, including Persian and Turkish. And the Council seeks to develop constructive academic and cultural interaction and partnerships between ASU and similar groups internally, domestically, and internationally in the Arab and the Muslim world. My own conviction has always been literature is often conceived as a cultural tool towards greater human understanding. The more we study others' literary arts, cultures, and civilizations, the better enabled we become to achieve understanding and to work, hopefully, toward world peace, especially given the global geopolitical situation that we're going through at this point. At this point, allow me, please, to introduce Dr. Suad Joseph, our distinguished speaker today. Dr. Suad Joseph is Distinguished Research Professor Emerita at the University of California, Davis. She is the founder of the Middle East section of the American Anthropological Association, the Association of Middle East Women's Studies, the Arab Families Working Group, and she founded and directed the University of California, Davis Arab Region Consortium. She was president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America. She is co-founder of the Arab American Studies Association, the Association of Middle East Anthropology, and Journal of Middle East Women's Studies. She has edited or co-edited 12 books and published over 100 articles, most recently reporting Islam, Muslim Women in the New York Times, and the Handbook of Middle East Women in 2023. The Politics of Engaged Gender Research in the Arab Region, Feminist Fieldwork, and the Production of Knowledge in 2021. The award-winning Arab American Women Representation and Refusal 2021. She has been general editor of the prize-winning Encyclopedia of Women and Islamic Cultures since its founding. She kindly invited me to contribute an article to that in 2007. She was awarded the UCL, the University of California Davis Teaching and Research Prize, the Middle East Studies Association Lifetime Service Award in 2019, and awarded also the Association of Middle East Women's Studies and the Arab American Studies Association Lifetime Service Awards, among many, many others. At this point, we would like to warmly welcome her. And her talk today is focusing on traumatic contestations, a struggle for a historical concept of trauma in the Arab region. And I'll give her the floor to speak about that. But the question she's posing is, how can we develop a concept of trauma for Gaza, for Palestine, for Lebanon, for Syria, for Iraq, for Libya, for Yemen, for Sudan, for Somalia, and in many other parts of the world. Her project is a call for conversations in the Arab region and for those who are about the Arab region to develop a concept of trauma appropriate for this transformative historical moment in the Arab region, for its circumstances, its cultural conditions. And it is a call for socializing the concept of trauma, registering trauma as the social condition of many Arab countries today. Dr. Joseph, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. We are very honored. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Souad Al-Ali. I want to thank Professor Souad Al-Ali for inviting me to this lecture series, and thank all of you for joining us. And I put into the chat, and I would really appreciate if you are able to put your camera on. Half of my screen is dark, and when the screen is dark, I have a really hard time interacting. So those of you who have the capacity to put your camera on, I would really like that kind of engagement. It helps a lot. So why struggle or fight over the concept of trauma? The idea of trauma has become globalized, and it is pretty much universalized. It's been mobilized politically, it's been weaponized, and it is a weapon of war. Yet in some ways, and we'll discuss, it has also been emptied of meaning. What I'm presenting to you today is a collaborative project that is working to develop a concept of trauma that would be relevant to the Arab region, which has been subject to considerable violence for over 100 years. In some ways, it is a call for conversations among scholars in the region and who care about the region to develop a historically and culturally appropriate concept of trauma for the region. I want to lay out the structure of the paper so that it gives you a kind of a handle of what to look for. I'm going to be making basically 10 points. And I would like to ask you, as I discuss these 10 points over the course of this presentation, look for the historical conjunctures. Look at the way that events come together at certain points in history that provide the context for understanding why we need a different concept of trauma for the Arab region. So the 10 points I'm going to discuss. First, I'm going to give an overview of the violence that this region has endured over the past 75 to 100 years, and that toll that violence has taken, both in deaths and actual people lost, and dislocations of people, either internally within their own countries or externally to become refugees. Second, I'm going to discuss the material that fuels this violence. That is, what are the sources of the arms and weapons without which such long-term violence would not be possible, and without which such sheer volume of death and dislocation would not have been possible. Third, we'll talk about the recognition that the enduring tolls of long-term and ongoing violence and disruption, the toll is trauma, in addition to many other things. Fourth, we're going to discuss how trauma has been defined by the Western professional mental health community and how treatment protocols are organized around that definition of trauma. 5, I'll offer a discussion of the construct of personhood that the psychiatric definition of trauma is built upon. 6th, I will offer a theorization about the construct of personhood, about the construct of personhood that is linked to the development of globalized capitalism. 7th, I'm going to suggest that the definition of personhood that undergirds the Western notion of trauma does not work for the Arab region, and suggest a theorization of an alternative framework for understanding the construct of self and personhood in the Arab region, or at least in the areas that I have worked most extensively, which are Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, and Syria, and to a smaller degree, Iraq. Then I'll talk about why the construct of trauma used by the professional mental health community in the West does not work in the Arab region. 9, I'll offer some framing anchors for a construct of trauma that is relevant to the Arab region. And 10th, I'll talk a bit about, well, what next? What are the next steps that we should be thinking about taking? But again, I want to encourage you to think about historical conjunctures as we go through these 10 points. So first, let's talk about a century of violence. There has been an unprecedented amount of political violence in the Arab region over the past century. Let's look at the numbers who are killed, and then after that, I will look at the numbers who are dislocated either internally or externally. Those killed. The mortalities from the wars in these Arab countries in the past 75, even just 75 to 80 years or so, add up to millions. Keep in mind that the population density of all of these countries is very low. And I'm focusing only on the tolls in the big events. There are many more deaths if you count the smaller events that have occurred, smaller degrees of violence. The Somalian Civil War, since 1991, 500,000 to 1 million killed in a population of 18 million. The Algerian War of Independence, 500,000 to 1.5 million killed from 1954 to 1962, 50,000 to 200,000 in the Civil War of the 1990s in a population of 46 million. The Lebanese Civil War, 150,000 to 200,000 killed from 1975 to 1990, 5 to 10,000 killed by Israel since 2023 in a population of just a little over 5 million. The Syrian Civil War, nearly 700,000 killed since 2010, and a reported 100,000 disappeared. That is close to 1 million population in a population of only 24 million. The US-led war on Iraq, 500,000 to 700,000 killed. Some studies even say 1 million deaths from 2003 to 2023 in a population of 46 million. The Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, over 1 million killed on both sides. Yemen, 400,000 killed in the ongoing war in a population of 35 million. The Libyan Civil War, 30 to 50,000 killed since 2010 in a population of only 7 million. Palestine, the hardest one to track how many have been killed. The 48 Nakba, 15,000. The 1967 war, the figures are, we have only figures for the Arabs altogether, 15,000, and Palestinians among them, of course. In the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the Sabra and Shatila massacres, 3,000 Palestinians killed. The first Intifada, 1987, 2,000 killed. The second Intifada, the year 2000, 13,500 killed. The Gaza Civil War of 2008, 7,000 killed. The war on Gaza of 2014, 2,000 Palestinians killed. The war on Gaza since 2023, somewhere between 70 to 100,000 killed, over 150,000 wounded, and a population of 6 million Palestinians in Palestine. Globally, there are about 14 million Palestinians. Of course, this does not count all of the smaller incidences that were in the 1 or 2 digits, or 3 digits even. If you add just those big events, 5 million Arabs killed in the past 75 to 100 years in the Arab region. And this does not count the wounded, which are many, multiple times that number. I think it's fair to say that this can be called a gradual genocide, and in some cases, a gradual curated genocide. Those are those killed, those gone, those are no longer among us. Let's look at those who have been dislocated within their own countries or have become refugees. The violence in the Arab region has produced millions of refugees and internally displaced. In 2020, just 5 years ago, about 55% of the refugees globally originated from the Arab region, according to the UN. By 2025, there were 44 million refugees globally, over 40% from the Arab region. And the difference between the 55% and the 40% is Ukraine created so many refugees. Over half of the refugees in the world come from Palestine, Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Sudan. with the largest single number coming from Palestine, Syria, and the Sudan. 1 out of every 6 refugees in the world is Palestinian. 70% of Palestinians worldwide are refugees, and about 1/2 of all Palestinians are stateless. And as we all know, there's been an active genocide in Gaza for the past 2 years, and over 2 million people in Gaza have been displaced multiple times. 1 in 6 refugees in the world is Syrian. The Syrian civil war left nearly half of the population dislocated within Syria internally, about 7 million, or externally, 6 million. Over 14 million Sudanese have been displaced, 1/3 of the population. And when Israel invaded Lebanon in 2024, as part of this current set of violence that we're witnessing, over 1 million people in Lebanon were displaced. That's 20% of the population were displaced. Yemen's civil war has produced one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Nearly 5 million internally displaced, and 18 million, 1/2 of the country's population, dependent on humanitarian aid. The war in Iraq from 2003 to 2023 displaced 1.2 million internally and left 2 million as refugees. Lebanon is a very special case. It hosts 2 million Syrian refugees, somewhere between 300 and 500,000 Palestinians, and a couple of 100,000 Iraqis and Sudanese. As those of you who study the Middle East know, the Lebanese financial system has collapsed, the state is paralyzed, and the 2020 Beirut port explosion left over 300,000 homeless. Lebanon has the highest per capita rate of refugees relative to the local population of any country in the world, and hardly anyone is helping. Lebanon has a population of a little over 5 million, and it has over 2 million refugees. And of course, what these numbers of people killed or people dislocated do not take account of is the education that's been lost, the disabilities that have mounted, the destruction of the social fabric and the social institutions, and the families torn apart. And what they don't account for is trauma. In these Arab countries, people have and have continued to live in political upheaval, unrest, instability, and non-functioning states. There's a long colonial and neo-colonial history to these political conditions, but we don't have time to discuss that in particular now. Okay, point 2. What are the sources of this material that allows this violence to go on for so long? Without military, industrial, technology complex of the major world powers, none of these wars would have been, or none of this violence, I should say, to make it broader, would have been possible, nor would the magnitude of deaths have been possible. None of the Arab countries produce that much arms. They would have run out of supplies in no time had they not had external suppliers. The Lebanese civil war went on for 15 years. Lebanon does not produce arms that would have supplied a 15-year civil war. The Syrian civil war went on for 13 years. Syria does not produce arms to supply 13 years of civil war. So who produces these weapons? Who makes it possible for this violence to continue for so long? In 2024, the United States exported 42% of all arms globally, supplying 100 countries. France and Russia exported 11% of the world arms each. Germany and China exported 6% each. Those 5 countries, the United States, France, Russia, Germany, and China, together exported 75% of the arms around the world. The 4 Western countries, the United States, France, Russia, and Germany, exported 70% of the arms that are being used around the world. The United States by itself exported almost half of all of the world's arms. So one can say modern killing is an industry, a Western industry, wrapped up in the industrial capitalist technology complex. One can say the production of such violence-driven trauma at the scale and magnitude that it has reached in the arid region is in large part made possible by this industrial capitalist technology complex. As a caveat, You note I've used the word civil war to address the figures and numbers in these countries. However, given the legacy of the 20th and 21st century colonialism, neocolonialism, and settler colonialism, and given the industrial capitalist technology complex that produces, distributes, and invested in the sale and use of arms globally, I think it's fair to say there is no such thing as a civil war today. Given the machinery of industrial capitalist technology and militarism, and given who supplies weapons to the militaries around the world, one can say the wars and violence in the Arab region are better understood as international. Perhaps now all wars are international. What the figures on the industries, technologies, and militarized violence do not reveal is the production of torture as a foundational tool of this mass violence. The use of torture is not new and is found in most state-level societies in some form or another. One can go back to the Catholic Church during the Inquisition, famously used torture for confessions. Marnia Lazarek documented the deployment of torture by the French during the Algerian War of Independence. The investments in the technologies of torture and the proliferation of torture as instruments of domination have expanded in the past half century, as Lisa Hajar has documented. Torture has become a science. Some of these technologies that the United States used in Iraq and the Abu Ghraib prisons were exposed by a whistleblower, Sergeant Joseph Darby. So torture is designed to produce trauma. So we've got the violence, the death, the dislocation, and where the material for all of this is coming from. So let's look at point 3, trauma in relationship to the industrial capitalist technology militarism complex. The production of trauma may be better understood not as an unfortunate side effect of these wars, but integral to the logic of war and violence. Trauma is part and parcel of the production of the industries and the technologies and the militarism that has been visited upon the Arab region in the last 100 years. Maya Wind, a young scholar, has researched the systematic production of technologies of trauma by the Israeli military in their occupation, deterritorializing, and genocide in the West Bank and Gaza in what she calls permanent war. She documents a project called Frontier Resilience, in which Israeli settlers are trained to live through perpetual violence. It is a project in which trauma is tamed in the name of a national project of elimination and dislocation of Palestinians. She refers to this as a project of social reproduction. So one can say trauma is woven into the fabric of industry, of capitalism, of technology, of militarism, as a project of domination and extraction stitches together the contemporary web of colonial, neocolonial, and settler colonial projects. So what are the questions that one can ask in this context? One question we can ask, what is trauma? On whose behalf did the concept of trauma emerge? Who gets to use the concept of trauma? How is the concept of trauma mobilized politically? How is trauma weaponized? On whose behalf is it weaponized? Against whom is it weaponized? And how can we rethink the concept of trauma in a way that is useful for the Arab region? That's point 3. Point 4, well, what is trauma? According to the mental health professions in the West, trauma is generally defined in the psychiatric literature as, quote, from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effect on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. This is sometimes referred to as psychological trauma to distinguish it from other types of trauma. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, that's kind of the Bible of the mental health professions. It has a broader definition of trauma. It expands the definition of trauma to include vicarious exposure. So it's exposure to actual death or threatened death, but also exposure to serious injury, sexual violence, in one or more of the following ways: directly experiencing the traumatic effect, witnessing it in person as it occurs to others, learning about the traumatic event that may have occurred to somebody close or intimate. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, what's called the DSM, is the standard reference for defining conditions for the medical and psychiatric professions. A little background. The concept of trauma emerged in the 1880s. It was developed more after World War I and even more after World War II. But the idea of trauma did not become mainstreamed until after Vietnam, and it was used to explain the psychological conditions after the men exposed to the violence of the Vietnam War returned home in a state of emotional and psychological injury. They were to be treated post-trauma, after the trauma of war, and hence the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In the 1960s and 70s, the concept of trauma was used by progressives to win treatment and benefit for Vietnam veterans. But later on, the progressive uses of the term trauma was co-opted, as Nadia Abul-Hajj has brilliantly documented. So that's the standard understanding of trauma. Number 5, what is the foundational concept in that concept of trauma that we need to trouble? Much of Western psychological, mental health work, social work presumes a specific notion of personhood for diagnostic and treatment purposes. And that notion of personhood that is built into the concept of trauma in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that concept of trauma is of a person who is a bounded, autonomous actor, the individual. And you heard me emphasize the term individual in the definition. The notion of the individual is, we need to trace that historically, emerged in Western political and economic theory with the political and economic transformations that also transformed social and psychological realities. The idea of the individual was theorized politically and politically institutionalized from the 17th century forward in Western social contract theory, and it became foundational for the Western notion of the modern nation, state, and citizen. So the concept of the individual, of the self or the person as an individual is embedded not only in psychiatric understanding of trauma, it's embedded in Western political and philosophical history. That's point 5. Point 6, well, what is the relationship between this specific notion of the individual and global capitalism? Why do I want to make this linkages? And this is, by the way, is going to be the subject of a whole nother project that we're working on, the team is working on together. The individual as a concept was essential, we would argue, to the concept of to the development of capitalism as a global project. Global capitalism needed to create mobile labor forces, which could be uprooted, torn away from the land, torn away from their families and communities, move to cities and other countries, and still be recognizable to themselves and others as a self and as a functioning self. Global capitalism, as it developed, needed labor based on a notion of selfhood that was autonomous, independent, contractual, bounded, and mobile. You can argue that capitalism cannot work without mobile labor. Labor has to be movable from city to city, country to country. And this was 17th, 18th, 19th century forward. Interestingly, the field of psychology developed in the 19th century parallel to the development of global capitalism. And psychology theorized and rationalized and operationalized a concept of self that was functional for this global mobile labor force. That is, psychology became a discipline that worked to heal the mental health traumas emerging in the industrial capitalist technology militarism complex of the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. Psychology has become a massive industry designed to produce the individual. And while the Arab region has produced its own genealogical development in the field of psychology, as Amni al-Shakri has brilliantly documented, it is predominantly Western psychology that has invested in the production of selves as individuals and has invested in a mental health industry and even insured industry to produce that individual. Take a look at these numbers. In the United States in 2012, a little over a decade ago, the number of offices of mental health professionals in the United States were numbered almost 66,000. By 2021, 4 years ago, they were 145, almost 146,000. The number of mental health professional offices doubled in less than a decade. In addition, there were 191,000 outpatient mental health and substance abuse centers in 2012 that had climbed from 191,000 to 264,000 by 2021. The number of psychiatric and substance abuse hospitals rose from 121,000 in 2012 to 150,000 in 2021. The United States currently supports more than 1 million mental health professionals. That's almost 1 for every 300 plus Americans. So I want to emphasize here, it's a very important point and caveat to keep in mind, is that I'm not making a critique of psychology or the mental health professionals. I'm looking at the parallels, the conjunctures of developments. And that's a big part of the argument here. There are certain conjunctures that have happened in common. So it's simply situating the field of psychology and the mental health professionals in the historical context of the transformations of the past 2 centuries, just as I have situated my own discipline of anthropology in the context of the development of this scholarly field of anthropology had its roots in imperial expansion. So psychology has made enormous contributions. So I want to acknowledge that and recognize that, but I'm looking at the conjunctures. So the concept of the individual, we would argue, has been suited for adaptation, is well suited for adaptation to the industrialism and to capitalist labor requirements and to the modern technologies and modern militarism. The concept of the individual has also been central to the notion of the nation state and to citizenship. In fact, if you look at the constitutions of most Western countries, the individual is assumed to be the basic unit of society, not the family, not the tribe, not the community. The individual is the basic unit of society. So look at these conjunctures. Global capitalism emerging, industrial capitalism and technology complex and wars expanding and in many cases becoming even globalized. The development of psychology as a field focusing on the concept of the individual and the concept of trauma emerging based in the concept of the individual. So we can say that the concept of the individual is foundational to mental health disciplines that generally assume mental health is within the individual and can be treated within the individual, that mental health is something within the individual, lays the foundation for mental health disciplines to assume that mental health problems are mental. Mental health problems are mental, in the head, between the ears of the individual, as Rita Giacomin has argued. Such a notion of the self as individual and mental health as residing in the head of the individual has supported the use of biomedical treatment as the remedy for trauma. Trauma has been pathologized, and the treatment of that pathology has been a combination of drugs and psychodynamic therapies focusing on the individual and whatever is in the head of the individual. Such Western mental health frameworks for understanding, treating trauma have been globalized. I want to make a caveat here. There are a number of mental health fields that have tried to rethink the concept of trauma and adapt treatment protocols to account for broader social context. There are fields of family therapy, couples therapy, relational psychology that address family and community relationships. But at the end of the day, their therapeutic practice and process is largely based on assumption that we have autonomous bounded selves in relationship to other autonomous bounded selves. Okay, point 7. Why does the Western concept of the individual not work for Arab cultures? Western mental health frameworks have been adapted and applied to the Arab populations, but they've largely ignored local cultural concepts and they've ignored differences between Arab and Western frameworks of mental health. The fundamental paradigm of the DSM-5 and most Western-trained psychologists and psychiatrists in the Arab region, because many of them have gotten their training in Europe or the United States, remains a biomedical model based on the Western notion of the self as an individual and trauma as located in the head of the individual. I want to make another caveat here, which is I want to be very careful that we're not essentializing Arab culture or Western culture. There are humongous differences within Arab culture, humongous differences within Western culture. But there are certain, nevertheless, there are certain sets of values, beliefs, social traditions that tend to be different among them. Western societies in general, while producing many forms of selfhood, tend to encourage the socialization of the individual self. Arab cultures tend to place high value on family and community and to encourage socialization of a self embedded in family and community, what I have in other publications called the relational self or the connective self. A relational self is characterized by relatively fluid boundaries and is highly attuned to the needs, desires, and views of significant others. And I would argue there's a pattern of preferential socialization of a relational self in most of these Arab countries that I've done research in. The concept of the relational self is very useful in understanding family systems in the Arab region, and it's also very useful in understanding how to approach trauma in the Arab region. So that's a different notion of selfhood. That's my point 7. Point 8, why the Western concept of trauma does not work in the Arab region. So I argued that we have a different notion of selfhood, arguably, in the Arab region. And now, why is the Western notion of trauma not so productive? First, there are many misuses of the concept of trauma. There is misplaced universalization, essentialization, globalization of the concept of trauma. The idea of trauma is applied so globally that it's flattened. I wager that almost everybody on the screen has at one point or another said something was traumatizing to them. And it could be as much as, somebody scared the dickens out of you, but we use that concept all the time. And when we use it so easily and readily, what I argue is that it flattens its meaning. It's almost emptied of meaning, which isn't to say you shouldn't use it. I'm just saying that that's what's happened with language. Second, the concept of trauma has been politicized. It's used as a political tool. Trauma is weaponized, used as a weapon of war or racism. The purposeful traumatization of a people as a way of disabling their social movements for rights and equality. Third, another reason why the concept of trauma does not work so well in the Arab region is that only certain kinds of trauma are recognized as trauma, as we see in the politics of victimhood. Only the trauma of certain people can be called trauma. The trauma of poverty, of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, of Islamophobia, of anti-Palestinian racism, of anti-Arab racism are often not visibilized as trauma. So, fourth, we can say that generally the Western approach to understanding trauma, as exemplified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, has focused on the person as an individual, rather than on the family or the community or the society as a whole. Trauma is seen as something between the ears, as Rita Jacquemin has pointed out, and this notion of trauma pathologizes the social suffering during war and conflicts, as Jacquemin has argued. Laura Sheehy and Stephan Sheehy have extensively documented that traumatization does not mean lack of agency or incapacity to act. In their extraordinary analysis, titled Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, they document the systematic resistance, the effective emotional life, and the powerful push toward liberation in Palestine, even under the worst condition of traumatization that they've experienced. Similarly, Nadra Shahub-Kevorkian has explicitly described the ongoing will to life of those who live under secular colonialism and under those traumatic conditions. She has pointed out the way they gather lemlema, the ashla, the fragments of the bodies, and the parallel between the gathering the arms and the limbs that are shorn apart, the parallel between that and the way they gather the olives and the grapes and the harvest. Her work exquisitely captures that kind of spirit of resistance. So that is why, those are parts of the reasons of why the concept of trauma of the DSM does not work in the Arab region. Number 9, then, what kind of concept of trauma could work? So what are the framing anchors? What are the anchor points of an alternative concept of trauma? Well, our argument, remember this is a collaborative project, is that the idea of trauma is largely a Western concept based on Western notions of the self and the individual. It's based on the idea that trauma is an event or a specific bundle of events that have caused injury and that can be healed or managed by treating the individual therapeutically post-trauma. Much of the approach and treatment of trauma in the Western psychiatry is based on a biomedical model in which trauma is pathologized. Our team, our collaborative project, suggests that shifting the framework to understand trauma as social suffering, along the lines that Rita Giacomin has argued. Rita, by the way, is part of the team. And that the solution is not biomedical, as Patrick Koga has argued, again, a member of the team, but rather solutions lie in the realm of social justice. We suggest socializing the concept of trauma through a decolonial project. So I've referred to our team repeatedly. So who is the us in our team? The Trauma Project is a collaborative project of the University of California Davis Arab Region Consortium, which consists of the American University of Beirut, the American University in Cairo, the Lebanese American University, Birzeit University, American University of Sharjah, and UC Davis. The scholars in this trauma project come from 5 of these 6 universities: AUB, AUC, LAU, Birzeit, and UC Davis. All of them are in the medical and mental health professions or in law, except me. We've been working together in the Arab region in various combinations capacities for 8 years. This particular theoretical, we've already published 3 articles, which we can give you the link to if you like. This particular theoretical framework that I'm presenting today has been a collaborative project developed by Rita Giacomin from Birzeit University, Kate Ellis from American University in Cairo, and myself. What is our approach? We distinguish between trauma that is at the level of the person and trauma that is at the level of the whole society. We distinguish between trauma as an event and trauma that is generational, that's been going on decade after decade after decade for 100 years. We distinguish between trauma that happened in the past versus trauma that is ongoing. We'd argue there's no such thing as post in the trauma that we're witnessing in the Arab region. And we suggest that culturally appropriate notions of the self, the person, must be conceptualized to assess and treat trauma in the Arab region. So, a historical and cultural concept of trauma. The idea of trauma needs to be constructed so that it is not between the ears of the individual. Rather, trauma that is occurring in the Arab region is societal. Whole societies have been upended. It's not an individual who has trauma in Gaza, it's the whole of society. Trauma is generational. Trauma has been experienced for decades or even 100 years in many of these countries. There's no post to PTSD, as the conditions that produce trauma continue to produce trauma and will likely continue for time to come. Treatment of trauma, that was point 1. Point 2, in our framework, treatment for trauma cannot be at the level of the person only. It has to be at the societal level. When trauma is on a societal scale, solutions must be at the societal level. You cannot resolve the trauma of a person in the private offices of a psychiatrist and then throw them back into the traumatic producing conditions that they live in. It's got to be addressed by social movements focused on social justice, on rights, on equality, on elimination of war and violence. Third, we need a new culturally appropriate concept of trauma. The contemporary conditions in the Arab region are social upheaval, political unrest, dislocation, violence, and warfare for much of the modern era. These social conditions have turned the Middle East in general and the Arab region in particular into the world's largest producer and host of refugees. So back to our questions. Who gets to be the subject of trauma? Whose trauma is legible? Whose trauma is visible? Trauma, we would argue, is too important a concept to be emptied of meaning. Is too important a concept to allow its Western historical roots to define its current meaning and uses. It is too important a concept to allow its political uses to go unchallenged. We need to claim the concept of trauma, and we need to socialize it. We suggest we need to claim the concept and conceptualize an historically and culturally appropriate concept of trauma and make it work on behalf of the people who have been traumatized at the societal level for generations and generations as a result of colonialism, neocolonialism, settler colonialism, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian racism practices and rhetoric. And we need protocols and practices based on social justice, on amnesty, on reparations, on return, on equality, on rights. We need to socialize the concept of trauma. What's next? Briefly, this is a decolonial project. It needs to work to develop historically and culturally appropriate concepts, and it is underway. The work of Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian stands out, as does the work of Omar Diwashi, Rita Jacquemin, Lara Sheehy, Stephen Sheehy, Lina Mehari, Nadine Husni, Osama Tanous, and many, many others. Many of these scholars are building on the work of Frans Fanon, as well as the more recent work of Derek Summerfield. I can go into the specifics what our team has done, where have we succeeded, where we failed, but I think ultimately it is a decolonial project, and as such, it can only be produce only successfully by being launched on the ground in the region. I believe we are in a historically transformative moment globally. We are in a moment where there is an intensification of contradictions, tensions, polarizations here and abroad. Such conditions of intensification of contradictions and tensions open up the possibility for new formations and formulations. The nature of historically transformative moments is that they often manifest things as impossible, as hopeless, of things are just getting worse and worse and worse. It is in such moments that impossibilities present themselves as possible. It remains for us to grasp the historical moment in which we live history, rather than let ourselves be lived by history. Thank you.
We cannot hear you. Your microphone is off.
Dr. Saad, yeah, please.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize that I was muted. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Suad Josie, for this very insightful, important, significant, and in-depth lecture. And I don't want to take much time before I open the floor for everybody to, and I can include my comments or questions later. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for discussion or questions. Please, if you would like to speak, unmute yourself. And according to Professor Saad Joseph, she wanted to see you on camera. So also please turn on your video on camera. So you can show a hand or just go ahead and begin speaking.
So I do apologize,
Miller?
like my camera is not working. So I have a couple of questions. So the first one is that I mean, as a survivor of the war of Iraq, I've seen every single war that Iraq went through. I came to the US in 2006. So my first question is that usually what happens from my understanding is that people usually, when they live in like a war zone, they don't usually feel like the trauma. They don't know what a trauma is because they're still under that war. Once they leave, okay, there are certain things that would actually change inside their brain that would trigger certain behavior, certain actions that they might not be able to explain. So most of the people who I I have this feeling that most of the people who actually stayed behind in the Middle East and never made it out of the war zone, okay, they don't have the trauma because they're still living in it. Okay, like the trigger is continuous, and usually they don't realize, like they don't have the time to kind of like question, why did I do this? Why did I do that? Because of the fact they're actually in a war zone, they're still under fire. So does that come into play? Okay, so like the studies that you actually mentioned, did the researchers actually work with the families and the individuals who stayed behind, or the families and the individuals who actually made it to a safe haven? And then they started realizing there are certain behaviors and actions that happen that they cannot explain why they actually acted the way that they acted. So that's actually my first question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, as I said, the team, the collaborators are in Egypt, Lebanon, and Palestine. They're right there on the front lines. We don't have a member of this project in Iraq, sadly. Although I presented this talk in May to, I think it was like 300 mental health professionals in Damascus and Syria, and they found it very useful as an approach for them as well. That's one of the reasons that Rita Giacomin, for example, uses the word social suffering, because to use the term trauma for those kinds of conditions pathologizes the suffering, makes it a problem in the head, when in fact it is a rational and natural and understandable response to the conditions of social upheaval and violence and war. That's one point, is that one of our team members, Rita Giacomin, being one particular, especially on this particular theoretical formulation that I presented today, prefers the term social suffering, and specifically to not pathologize. That's one point. The other point is, and the point I'm especially interested in, is that when it's happening to the whole society, you don't experience it as a, quote, individual. It's happening to everybody around you. And so the experience of it is completely different than when you get extracted from it, and then you are an individual, so to speak, or a separate person. But the fact that it doesn't have certain kinds of, quote, recognizable manifestations does not mean that there's no trauma there. It's
okay. I keep actually telling people that I mean, after every single war that I actually went through in Iraq, usually people who escape war, like one war zone after another, once they make it to a safe haven, they start living their life as kind of like an insurance appraisal. They kind of like calculate the risk factor in every single situation or context that they're actually put in. And recently I come across a term which is the complex PTSD. Okay, which is when you go up and down, which is like war and then safe haven, war and then safe haven. Is that something that the researchers actually found? Because I know, for example, in the case of like many refugees in like displaced families, they, for example, in the case of Iraq, they left Baghdad. Okay, they went to the north of Iraq, and then they were threatened in the north of Iraq. They made it to Syria. They were threatened in Syria. They made it to Lebanon. They were threatened in Lebanon. So kind of like seeking safe haven, and it's like relative safety, and then all of a sudden, like the situation, okay, gets back in, taking them to kind of like the first step, which is feeling unsafe and like wanting to move. So does the term complex PTSD like come into play like in the research findings or not?
The condition that you describe absolutely comes into play. There are a lot of different terminologies. The language that is used for describing conditions has not been standardized. Just remember how recent it is that the concept has come into play.
Sure.
So it would be described differently in Palestine than it might be described in London or here. But those conditions that you described are very recognizable conditions and certainly are conditions that fall under the umbrella of trauma. For me, the concern is, and by the way, all of our team, the overwhelming majority of the team is in Egypt, Lebanon, Palestine. We have a couple of us here. One of our team here is himself a refugee from Romania and had been in prison and tortured there. And so speaks directly from experience. We have an enormous amount of experience on this team of these issues. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sulaiman. Shall we?
Thank you
Thank you very much.
We have
Thank you.
a couple of questions on chat here. Kal Saidi, and he said, in our class, Professor Omar Sulaiman emphasized the importance of family honor in Middle Eastern culture. So I was wondering, he said, if the idea of family honor ever makes it harder for people to speak up about pain or trauma. His other question, and Dr. Joseph, you can follow that on chat. Another question, he said, how do migration and living in different countries change the way Arab families handle their past experiences with trauma? And then he also has a third question. And she said, last but not least, can trauma from war ever bring people together, like creating unity or shared strength instead of just pain? So those are on chat. You can follow up Dr. Joseph or Saudi.
Yeah. Well, the concept of trauma is, the concept of family honor is a highly contested concept that has been used for a long time to describe families not only in the Arab world, but Turkey and Iran, and for that matter, in the Mediterranean, Italian and Greek and Southern European families. I say it's contested because how we understand it and how we explain behavior in relationship to it has been quite controversial, let's say. So your question is, can that help people come together? And can that help people overcome pain and trauma? I think the point that especially Rita Giacoman's work points out is that it's because they hold so strongly onto their families and the communities that we should call this a social suffering, because they're standing together and they're resisting and they have their voices and they refuse to be emotionally destroyed by it. So whether you put that under the rubric of family honor or family intimacy or family loyalty or community relations, for me, it's related to the concept of relationality, that people in the region are deeply connected to others. They don't. So I think one can certainly use that term, but I think it'd be safe to say it's far broader than that. How has migration and living in different countries changed the way Arab families handle their past experiences? I don't think there could be any one answer to that. If they go to Germany, it would be very different than if they go to Russia, or if they go to Italy, or if they go to Brazil. I mean, are they going alone? Are they going with their families? Do they get a job? Are they unemployed? Do they get citizenship? Are they considered undocumented? I don't know that I could give you an answer to that, but migration can make it easier, can make it far worse. I think Professor Sulaiman pointed to some of those issues in his very insightful commentary. So a very important question, but there can't be a single answer to it. And I think one of my former students did her dissertation, then published the book on Iraqi refugees that she worked with in Iraq and that settled in the Boston area. That I think was incredibly insightful, the way family reemerged as so important under their conditions of trauma. Last question. Yes, of course. And I think, again, I point to the work of Rita Giacoman. Can trauma from war bring people together? And that is precisely part of what she's talking about, is that they are not, it's not just individuals suffering as individuals, quote, with individuals in quote, but these are communities. And they hold themselves dear. One of my former graduate students is now a professor at Birzeit University. And in this past 2.5 years, they spent so much time going from funeral to funeral, condolences to condolences. They're there for each other. And that building of the community is a good part of what allows them to maintain themselves and maintain their resistance. Professor Suad, did you want me to continue with these questions, or do you have some questions live from people on?
Yeah, I'd like to invite, our faculty and students, if they would like to have questions live, and then if there are any on chat, we'll deal with that later.
I do
it-
have a question here, if you can hear me properly.
I can.
Dalia, go
Please
ahead.
proceed.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Souad and Dr. Souad, for this very informative lecture. I find myself having a few questions and a few points. My first question is, I am from Sudan, which is right now a huge open wound in Africa that the world is kind of severely ignoring. And also, as a student of counseling and mental health, I'm very interested in your project and how you and your team, what's your vision? How do you see that implemented, like in real life? If the war were to stop now in my country and I would go there to implement your project, what would it look like? Especially since, infrastructure is gone, pretty much everything is gone. Another point that I had is the term social suffering. While it is absolutely social suffering, it's communal, it's the whole society that is going through violence in multiple forms of it, and atrocious forms of it, like rape, gang rape, Darfur is a great example of that. I find myself struggling to find words because I'm so passionate about it. But what is happening now in Al-Fashir, structured, it's genocide happening in many places in Sudan, in Gaza, but something so severe like this, I think calling it social suffering, it's just like putting a very nice bow on a very, very, ugly thing that we are looking at. I think it needs to be shocking. Trauma, this is trauma that is it's affecting us now, even us here, safe and sound in the US. I think it needs to be shocking. And the term social suffering is very, very nice to read on articles and in books and to write about, but it does not fully describe reality. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for that passionate question. I mean, the situation in Sudan hardly ever makes a newspaper. I mean, it's just been completely sidestepped. 14 million refugees. It's stunning, and the 700,000. I mean, a huge number of deaths. For your first question was what to do. What if the war stopped right now and you were to go back? What to do? There obviously isn't a single answer to that. What we have proposed for the next steps that I didn't get into because I was worried about time is to set up for the Arab region, and the area that I worked in most closely is Egypt, Lebanon, and Palestine, and we tried to raise money to set up regional councils of practitioners who are working on the ground, to develop the appropriate concepts, because overwhelmingly they've adapted Western concepts in the area locally, is to establish regional councils that can work together to not only build a toolkit for understanding the trauma locally, but also to establish protocols for how to proceed. Because I don't think that any of us sitting here can develop a toolkit or conceptual framework. And we can develop frameworks, but I think the actual on-the-ground working things have to be developed there. So my work here is to work with my colleagues there to see what can be developed. We've submitted several proposals to do the work on the ground. We did a stupid thing. We applied to the National Institute of Mental Health 3 times, got rejected 3 times, until it dawned on us we're applying to the very agency that holds these concepts that we're criticizing, holds those concepts sacred. So we tried to apply it. We applied to some regional foundations and haven't gotten the proper funding yet. I got a small grant from Davis, and we were able to do some of the work based on that. So I think the steps would have to be there, and the people who are not there do the best they can to support the people who are there working on the ground to see what works. Number one, for your first question. Second comment, why call it social suffering? There's a strategic reason that Rita Jacquemin uses the term social suffering. She doesn't at all ignore trauma. She's very aware of trauma. But so the concept of trauma, the way it is circulated, not only pathologizes, but almost immobilizes, makes it seem as the people there cannot act. They are only victims. There's no agency. There's no sense of resistance or purposefulness. And her use of social suffering is a way of arguing there's still agency, there's resistance, there's community, there are people who are acting on the ground. And so that distinction between which does not override the reality of trauma, but parallels in recognition of the fact that these are people who still have a sense of purpose and action. So she's being strategic in how should I say, mobilizes vocabulary. So much. I've spent the concept. I don't know if any of you have read the work on relationality that I've published, but it took me 2 decades to come up with that language. My first insights into that, gosh, there's a very different notion of selfhood here, was in the 1970s. My first article that actually published was in the 1990s. Words matter. The way you conceptualize a process or event or sets of conditions matter. They matter a lot. And so we have to look at the way the words that we use package with them certain things that we may or may not want to travel with us. So just one comment about why that term social suffering may be useful. It's also to put the emphasis on the social. That whole Sudan has been turned upside down. Gaza has been turned upside down. Syria has been turned upside down. And you could go on and on. Libya's turned upside down. I mean, what has gone on in the Arab region in the past century is unforgivable.
Mhm.
Someone else?
I have one. Can I just ask one more question about the word pathologizing? It is. I get the concept. The word trauma can pathologize symptoms of a societal violence. I get that, but who is pathologizing to who? Who is like? Is it? Are we trying to protect the victim from feeling pathologized, or are we trying to protect them from being pathologized by Western mental health standards?
When at some level, maybe both. When we are concerned about the pathologizing of trauma, it's the way that pathologizing leads to biomedical treatments. Is to say there's something wrong with you, that this happened, something wrong with you, something wrong in your head, as opposed to there's something wrong in the social condition that you're living in. And we're trying to lift it up from the placing the dilemma inside of the body and the head of that person, and focus the dilemma on the social conditions in which they live. So the concern with the use of the term pathology is that it tends to say the problem is in the person rather than in the conditions, which is not to say that that person does not have problems. It's to say you've got to look at the conditions.
The question from Taylor on chat, then we can open it up again for those live discussions. She said, I have one quick question. Someone in the US who will be going into the field of religious and culturally informed trauma counseling, how should I learn more about societal trauma versus just individual trauma? I'm interested in learning and reading more about this topic to see how I can implement it in the future.
That's from Professor Taylor. Thank you for that. That's a very important question. I cannot comment about the field of religious studies and the spiritual treatment of trauma, because that's not my field, but I think it's an important field. But there's a lot of literature now. In the past 20 years, I would say a lot has been written and around these concepts, especially in the past 10 years. If you'd like to send me an email, I'm glad to forward to you. We did a review of the literature. We did 2 reviews of the literature, one narrative and one more focused. And they've been published, and we'll be glad to send them to you. They have an extensive bibliography. You know?
Dr. Amr Suleiman, he has a follow-up, but if anybody else has a question that they haven't had a chance, we can do that and then go back to Dr. Amr.
I just have quick comment.
Could you put your
Thank you
camera
so.
put your camera on, please, so I can see who's
Yeah,
asking.
my camera. I'm sorry, my camera is not working. I was waiting for my husband to fix it, but
A
I'm
lot of
starting.
cameras are not working here in Arizona. What's happening to you? You gotta.
So Dr. Sarah Risha came late, so we did not introduce her. She's also,
Welcome.
teaching Arabic studies.
أهلين.
Go ahead.
Thank
Go ahead,
you.
Sarah.
تفضلي.
Yeah. Thank you. I was just going to comment. This is really very important, and as you know, very sensitive issue for the Arab culture. And that people will be going through a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, but no one would talk about it. The most important thing, what other people think. It's not like they don't have to deal with, or like, being like courage to face it and do it. So you introduced very good points, and it is really very important for everyone to realize and to work on it if they have anything or any problem. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Professor Sutter. I really appreciate your feedback. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you very
joining
much.
us.
And so before we go to Dr. Amr, Catherine, she said, I was about to ask a similar question, maybe I think related to religion. She said, how important is it to consider dealing with trauma from an Islamic perspective, especially as a Westerner?
Again, I'm not a scholar of religion, so I can't answer that. But I would say, how important is it to treat trauma in the West from a Christian perspective? We tend